Hi, I'm David Dodge. Welcome to Green Energy Futures. Norman Crowley's an Irish millionaire who successfully created the Cool Planet Group, a carbon empire of companies addressing climate change. In the middle of a lengthy interview, he offered this optimistic assessment of climate change.
So I believe that climate change will be fully resolved by 2030.
Norman Crowley's faith in climate capitalism seems a tad optimistic. But before you scoff at his theory, let's unpack it.
And it's got nothing to do with governments and regulation, because if it had to do with governments and regulation, we would still be here in 2100. But it has to do with economics, right? And so if you take the top 5 issues on climate change in the world, okay, they vary around 3 subjects, right? First one is energy, then transport, then food, right? Let's take energy.
Crowley says transitioning to zero carbon energy is the first big problem to solve.
So during COVID, a couple of PPAs were announced, power purchase agreements, for solar and battery, and they were at between 1 and 2 cents a kilowatt hour. So that means it's all over for fossil fuels in energy, right? Because that cost is going to have again in the next 5 years, and nothing can compete with it.
The lowest price energy is now renewables, but it's so-called precipitous events that has Crowley convinced the transition will happen faster than we can imagine.
All around climate change at the moment, the precipitous events are happening by the second. Like, we have oil and gas companies that are clients of ours that publicly announced this year that they have no dividends anymore. So if you're a pension fund and you hold an oil stock, like if you take BP, for example, which is making a great pivot to renewable energy, but this year it halved its dividends. So if I'm Standard Life and I need to pay a pension, right, then I can't hold BP stock anymore. So now all the big pension funds can't hold BP stock. Big problem, right? So the precipitous events will make the other side go faster.
The second reason Crowley believes climate change will be solved by 2030 is the transition to electric vehicles is already happening, as automakers have already moved $300 billion in investment into EVs. And he expects precipitous drops in battery prices.
Like, a lot of people don't believe it, but if you look at the data, like, if you're anyway financially astute and you look at the data around electric cars and you think ICE is going to be okay past 2030, you are not a good person at judging numbers, right? Because all of the graphs are just going in one direction right now. And so that's transport is done.
Crowley says a precipitous event in the food industry solves problem number 3.
And then the biggest one that's left is food. And in food, there's a company called Solar Foods in Finland, and they are creating, not even in a lab, they now have a factory doing it. They are creating protein. They're creating a powder that's 70% protein, 20% carbs, 10% fats, and other things, out of thin air, right? They're creating this. It's 10 times cheaper than dairy protein powder, and it uses something like 100 times less land, or even more than that.
Crowley says what's driving this transition to climate change solutions is pure economics.
Because it's a classic 80-20 rule. When you get those top 5 problems out of climate change, we're done. Now, what's driving those is not government regulation. What's driving that is pure economics. There is a wall of private equity money going in, like 6.3 trillion, right, over the next 5 years, going into these opportunities.
To hear more about why Crowley believes that climate change will be solved by 2030, head to GreenEnergyFutures.ca and listen to our full-length interview. For Green Energy Futures, I'm David Dodge.
But in the garage right now, there is a 1981 Ferrari 308, which has been electrified. There is a 1972 Land Rover Series 3 that's absolutely beautiful and has been electrified. And then there's a 1963 Corvette Stingray. And the Corvette Stingray is in the process of being electrified. And for those car nerds listening, it will go from 267 brake horsepower, maybe, although I think some of those horses have died over the years, to 2,000 brake horsepower.